Last time on Afro-K Romance Fairy Tale, Joan Daniels walked into her brother's wedding and came face to face with the one man she had spent 7 years trying to forget, Junho Kwon, her brother Emika's powerful Korean Mafia boss best friend. The man who had disappeared without a single word the morning after their last night together, leaving her pregnant, alone and quietly devastated. He walked into that wedding hall like he owned every room he had ever entered. And then his eyes found hers across the golden light, and dropped to the little girl beside her who had his exact eyes. Grace, 7 years old. The secret Joan had carried completely alone. By the end of that evening, Junho had told Joan the truth. His father had threatened Emika's life to force him back to Seoul. He had disappeared to keep her safe. He hadn't known about Grace. And standing on that dim terrace under the night sky with the reception glowing behind them, he had traced the line of her jaw the way he had the very first night and said the words that brought the last wall down. Joan Daniels gave Junho Kwon one chance. And now the real story begins. She heard Emika's voice before she even reached the bottom of the stairs. Low, controlled. The particular quiet of a man who is too angry to shout. Joan's hand tightened on the hotel corridor railing and she stopped walking. Through the glass partition of the hotel restaurant she could see them both. Junho sitting with the stillness of a man who had made a decision and was prepared to absorb every consequence of it. And Emika, her brother, her protector, the man who would have dismantled the entire world for her, sitting across from him with his jaw set and his eyes burning with something that was equal parts fury and devastation. On the table between them sat a breakfast neither of them had touched. Joan knew immediately. He had told him everything. Before she had woken up. Before she had even decided how to begin that conversation herself. Junho Kwon had walked into that restaurant, sat across from her brother and handed over every secret Joan had been carrying alone for 7 years. Her first feeling was fury. Her second, buried so quickly she almost missed it, was relief. She pushed through the restaurant door. Both men looked up simultaneously. Emika's expression cracked the moment he saw her face. And Joan Daniels, who had held herself together through 7 years of single motherhood, stood in the doorway of a hotel restaurant in Abuja and felt the full weight of everything she had never said pressing against the back of her throat. This was going to be the hardest breakfast of her life. Welcome to Afro-K Romance Fairy Tale. On today's episode you get a dose of betrayal, power, romance, love, unexpected encounters and a beautiful beginning. If this is your first time here, make sure to like, subscribe, click the notification icon to get a reminder when new amazing stories drop, and send this story to friends and family who you think would love to watch it. And also tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I'd really love to know. Now let's dive back into this amazing story. Joan had always known this conversation would come eventually. She had rehearsed versions of it in the shower at 2 in the morning. She had constructed careful arguments and measured explanations. She had imagined Emika's face 100 different ways. Angry, hurt, confused, betrayed. She had prepared for all of it in theory. Nothing prepares you for the actual moment. She sat down at that table without being invited and looked at her brother directly. Emika was staring at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. The expression of a man realizing that the person he thought he knew completely had been carrying an entire hidden world inside themselves for 7 years right beside him. Grace, he said. Just that. Just her name. Joan held his gaze. Yes. 7 years, Joan. His voice was low and careful, and underneath the control of it she could hear everything he wasn't letting himself say yet. 7 years you raised her alone and you never. Not once. I handled it. Joan said quietly. You handled it. Emika repeated the words slowly like he was turning them over looking for the sense in them. You handled it alone. With my best friend's child. While I was right there. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room completely. Junho had not spoken since Joan sat down. He was watching them both with the measured stillness of a man who understood that this was not his moment to manage. He had lit the fire. The least he could do was let it burn properly. Emika turned to him then. And you? The warmth that usually lived in Emika's voice when he spoke to Junho was completely absent. In its place was something harder and more complicated. The sound of a brotherhood being stress-tested in real time. You disappeared. My sister. Carrying your child. Yes, Junho said simply. And you're telling me now, the morning after my wedding, that it was because of your father. Emika's jaw tightened. That my life was used as leverage to pull you away from her. Yes. Emika was quiet for a long moment. He looked down at the untouched food in front of him. When he looked back up, his eyes were wet in a way Joan had only seen twice in her entire life. At their father's funeral and the night their mother was hospitalized 3 years ago. I didn't know, Emika said finally. His voice had dropped to almost nothing. About any of it. Joan, I swear to you I didn't know. I know you didn't, Joan said softly. You should have told me. I know. I would have. He stopped. Pressed his hand flat on the table. I would have been there. For all of it. For Grace's first word and her first steps and every single thing I missed because you decided to handle it alone. Joan felt her eyes burn. I was protecting you, she said. Both of you. From each other. From what knowing the truth would have done to everything. Emika looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she did not expect. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Large, warm, steady. The hand of her big brother who had held her world together more times than she could count. You are the strongest and most stubborn woman I have ever known in my life, he said. And I am so angry at you. Joan let out a breath that was almost a laugh. I know. And I love you more than anything. He squeezed her hand once. Hard. Then he turned back to Junho and the warmth evaporated again instantly. You and I are not finished. Junho met his gaze steadily. I know. But right now, Emika glanced between them both. Someone needs to tell me what happens next. Because I have a niece with this man's eyes and a sister who just gave him one chance, and I need to know that chance means something real. The table went quiet. Joan looked at Junho. Junho looked at Joan. And in that look, across a hotel breakfast table in Abuja with Emika watching and the morning light coming through the windows, something shifted between them. Quiet. The first thread of something being rewoven. It means something real, Junho said. He was not looking at Emika when he said it. He was looking at Joan. 2 weeks later, Lagos. Joan had cleaned her apartment 3 times that morning. She would never admit that to anyone. Not to Chisholm, who had called twice already asking for updates. Not to Emika, who was still in the careful process of rebuilding his feelings about the entire situation one brick at a time. And certainly not to herself, because Joan Daniels did not clean her apartment 3 times on a Saturday morning because a man was coming over. She cleaned it because she liked things orderly. She was a woman of routine. It had nothing to do with anything else. Grace was sitting on the living room rug in her favorite yellow dress, arranging her stuffed animals into what she had described at breakfast as a very important meeting. She had been informed that morning that her uncle's friend was coming to visit. She had received this information with the same unbothered confidence she received most information, a simple nod and a return to whatever she had been doing. Joan envied her daughter's nervous system deeply. The knock at the door came at exactly 11 o'clock. Of course it did. Junho Kwon had never been late for a single thing in his life. Joan smoothed her dress. A simple fitted cream wrap dress, nothing significant, purely practical, and opened the door. He was standing in her doorway in a dark navy fitted shirt and tailored charcoal trousers. No overcoat, no tie. The most undressed she had seen him in years, and somehow it made him look more dangerous, not less. In his left hand he held a small brown paper bag. In his right hand, and this was the thing that stopped Joan's breath completely, he was holding a small stuffed brown bear with a yellow ribbon around its neck. He had brought Grace a gift. Joan stared at the bear. Junho followed her gaze. Something almost resembling uncertainty crossed his expression, a thing so rare on his face it was almost unrecognizable. I didn't know what she liked, he said quietly. I asked Emika. He said yellow was her favorite color. Joan looked up at him. The man who had commanded boardrooms and dismantled rival organizations and made grown men step aside when he entered rooms was standing at her apartment door, holding a stuffed bear with a yellow ribbon, looking at her like she was the most important jury he had ever faced. She stepped aside to let him in. Grace looked up from her very important meeting the moment he entered. She assessed him with a thorough, unself-conscious scrutiny that only 7-year-olds and very wise old women possess. Her eyes went to the bear immediately. "Is that for me?" she asked. "Yes," Junho said. "What's his name?" Junho blinked. He had not prepared for this question. He doesn't have one yet." Grace nodded seriously. "That's okay. I'll name him." She stood up, walked across the rug with complete composure and took the bear from his hand. She examined it carefully, turning it over. Then she looked up at him. "His name is Cookie." Something moved through Junho's expression. "Cookie," he repeated. "Yes. Sit down." She pointed at the sofa with the authority of someone who had never once questioned whether she was in charge. "You can be in the meeting." Junho looked at Joan. Joan pressed her lips together to contain the smile that was trying to happen on her face and went to make tea. From the kitchen she could hear Grace running the meeting with complete seriousness, introducing each stuffed animal by name and assigned role, explaining the agenda which appeared to involve a dispute between a rabbit and a lion over territory, and occasionally directing questions at Junho, who answered each one with the same gravity he brought to everything. Joan stood at the kitchen counter with the kettle boiling and listened to the most powerful man she had ever known earnestly giving his opinion on whether a stuffed rabbit had the right to claim a corner of a rug that the lion had occupied first. Her chest did something completely inconvenient. She brought the tea out 20 minutes later to find Grace cross-legged on the sofa beside Junho, Cookie the bear in her lap, explaining with great seriousness that her mummy was the best air hostess in the whole world and had been to 17 countries, which was more than anyone Grace knew personally. Junho was listening with his complete and total attention. No phone. No distraction. Every part of him present in a way that Joan recognized. It was how he had once listened to her, like she was the most interesting person who had ever existed. He was doing it for Grace now. Joan set the tea down quietly and sat across from them. Junho glanced at her briefly. That glance, warm, soft, carrying something deep and private, lasted less than 2 seconds, but Joan felt it in her chest for much longer. Then Grace looked between them both with those sharp almond eyes and asked, with a casual devastation that only children could achieve, "Are you my mummy's boyfriend?" The room went completely still. Joan opened her mouth. "I am working on it," Junho said quietly. Grace considered this with great seriousness. Then she nodded. "Okay," she said simply, and returned to Cookie. Joan stared at Junho. He looked back at her steadily. Certain. The ghost of something that was almost a smile at the corner of his mouth. And Joan Daniels, who had cleaned her apartment 3 times that morning for no particular reason, felt the second wall she didn't know she was still standing behind develop a very significant crack. The visits became a rhythm. Every Saturday, 11 o'clock. Junho at the door, always exactly on time, always with something small for Grace. A book about animals 1 week. Puzzle the next. A set of watercolor paints the week after that, which Joan had privately predicted would end in disaster and which had instead ended in Junho sitting at her kitchen table for 2 hours with paint on his very expensive shirt, helping Grace produce what she declared was a masterpiece and what Joan privately thought looked like a sunset having an argument with itself, but which she photographed quietly from the doorway anyway. Grace had accepted Junho into her Saturday world with the same fearless ease she had grabbed his hand on the dance floor. No suspicion. No guardedness. She simply made room for him the way children make room for things that feel right, completely and without ceremony. It was Joan who was taking longer. She watched him carefully every Saturday, looking for the performance, looking for the moment the effort became visible, the moment he checked his phone or got distracted or gave Grace the fraction of his attention instead of all of it. She was waiting for the crack in the version of him that showed up at her door every week. Never came. He was the same every time. Present, patient, completely, almost disarmingly genuine. He learned Grace's stuffed animals by name within the first 2 weeks. He remembered that she didn't like the crusts on her sandwiches. He discovered by accident that she was frightened of ceiling fans, and from that Saturday forward he never once sat beneath one without quietly shifting their spot first. Joan noticed all of it. She noticed and said nothing and filed it somewhere deep and carefully guarded inside herself. Then one Saturday evening, the fifth visit, a rainy October evening, Grace fell asleep on the sofa between them during a film they had been watching together. She had been fighting sleep in the Joan Daniels tradition, eyes blinking heavily, insisting she was not tired, and then suddenly she was simply gone. Head dropping sideways onto Junho's arm, Cookie the bear clutched to her chest, breathing the deep, even breath of a child with no complications in the world. Junho went completely still. He looked down at Grace with an expression that Joan had never seen on a human face before. It was the expression of a man who had just understood something about his own life that he could not undo or unfeel. Overwhelmed. Grateful in a way that had nowhere to go. He did not move. He sat completely still so she would not wake up. Joan watched him from her side of the sofa. She said nothing for a long time. The rain came quietly down the windows. The film played on unwatched. Then Junho said softly, not looking away from Grace, "I have missed so much." It was not a complaint. It was not an accusation. It was just the truth, spoken quietly into a rainy evening by a man sitting with the full weight of it. Joan looked at her daughter's sleeping face. "Yes," she said simply. "You have." Another silence. Comfortable in a way that silences between them were only just beginning to be. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making up for it," he said. Still quiet. Still not looking away from Grace. Joan looked at him then. His profile. At the jaw she had spent 7 years trying to forget and could not. At the hands that had once held her like something sacred now holding absolutely still so a sleeping child would not be disturbed. "I know," she said softly. Junho turned to look at her. Their eyes held across the sleeping child between them. Something passed between them in that look. Deep, quiet, and irreversible. Not a kiss. Not a touch. Just a look that settled something that had been unsettled for 7 years. Joan looked away first. But she was smiling when she did. The following Saturday Junho did not come alone. Joan opened the door at 11 o'clock and found him standing in the corridor looking, for the first time in all the weeks she had known him, genuinely uncomfortable. Behind him, slightly to his right, stood a woman. She was in her early 60s. Korean. Immaculately presented in a way that suggested tremendous wealth worn with total restraint. A pale gray silk blouse, perfectly tailored dark trousers, a single strand of pearls at her throat. Her hair was silver-streaked and pinned with architectural precision. Her posture was the posture of a woman who had never once in her life walked into a room and felt she did not belong there. Her eyes went to Joan immediately. They were dark, cessing, completely unreadable. "Joan," Junho said carefully. "This is my mother, Mrs. Kwan." Joan looked at the woman. The woman looked at Joan. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds and contained an entire conversation. "Mrs. Kwan," Joan said. Her voice was level. Her posture matched the older woman's completely. "I wasn't expecting you." "No," Mrs. Kwan said. Her English was precise and lightly accented, and delivered with the quiet authority of someone who chose every word deliberately. "You weren't." The faintest smile crossed her lips. It did not reach her eyes. Joan stepped aside to let them both in with the composure of a woman who had not just felt the temperature of her entire life drop several degrees. Grace looked up from the rug as they entered, assessed the new arrival with her characteristic thoroughness and said, "Are you Cookie's grandmother?" Mrs. Kwan looked down at the small mixed-race child looking fearlessly up at her. Something crossed the older woman's face. Gone before anyone could name it. "Who is Cookie?" she asked. Grace held up the stuffed bear with the yellow ribbon. "He's mine," she said simply. "Junho gave him to me." Mrs. Kwan looked at the bear. Then at Grace. Then across the room at Joan with those dark, unreadable eyes. "I see," she said quietly. And Joan, who had survived more than this woman could possibly imagine, held that gaze without blinking and thought, "Here we go." Mrs. Kwan requested tea. It was not a question. It was the kind of statement that arrived dressed as a request, polite on the surface and underneath it the quiet assumption that things would proceed exactly as she intended. Joan recognized the technique immediately because she had spent years watching powerful people use it in airport lounges and business-class cabins. The art of making a demand feel like a courtesy. She made the tea anyway. Junho stayed in the living room with Grace, who had immediately recruited him back into the ongoing territorial dispute between the rabbit and the lion, which had apparently escalated significantly since last Saturday. Joan could hear Grace's voice. Serious, animated, completely unbothered by the fact that a woman who looked like she owned small countries was sitting on her mother's sofa watching her with those dark, calculating eyes. Joan brought the tea out on a tray. Mrs. Kwan accepted her cup with both hands the Korean way, a gesture so automatic it was clearly bone deep, and looked around Joan's apartment with the measured attention of someone conducting a quiet assessment. The framed photographs on the wall, Grace's drawings pinned neatly beside the bookshelf, the small airline memorabilia on the side table, the evidence of a life built carefully and completely from scratch. "You have a lovely home," Mrs. Kwan said. "Thank you," Joan said. "You built all of this alone." It was not a question. "Yes." Mrs. Kwan nodded slowly. She looked at Grace, who was now standing on the sofa cushion delivering what appeared to be a closing argument in the stuffed animal dispute, while Junho listened with his complete and total attention. The older woman watched them for a long moment, her son and this child, with an expression Joan could not fully read. Then she turned back to Joan. "You are a remarkable woman," she said. "I mean that genuinely." Joan said nothing. She had been in enough difficult conversations to know that a compliment at the beginning of one was rarely just a compliment. "My son," Mrs. Kwan paused, set her teacup down with precise delicacy. "Junho has always been extraordinary, brilliant, disciplined. He has carried the weight of our family's legacy since he was 19 years old. Everything he has done, every sacrifice, every difficult decision, has been for the preservation of something much larger than himself." "I'm aware of what he sacrificed," Joan said evenly. "And who he sacrificed it for." Something shifted in Mrs. Kwan's eyes. Respect, perhaps, or recalibration. "Then you understand," the older woman continued, "that the world Junho comes from, the world he is still navigating, regardless of what he may have told you about his father, is not a world that accommodates." She paused, choosing her word with surgical precision. "Complications." Joan felt something cold and steady settle in her chest. "Is that what Grace is? A complication?" "That is what any attachment becomes," Mrs. Kwan said, "when it creates vulnerability in a man in my son's position." She reached into the structured leather bag beside her and placed a cream envelope on the coffee table between them. Sealed. Expensive looking in the way that things are when the amount inside them is not meant to be questioned. Joan looked at the envelope, then back at Mrs. Kwan. "I want you to understand," the older woman said, "that this is not cruelty. This is protection. For you. For your daughter. For Junho. Whether he is currently capable of seeing that or not." She folded her hands in her lap. "A clean, quiet arrangement. Generous enough to give you and Grace an extraordinarily comfortable life anywhere in the world you choose. All I ask in return is that you allow my son to return to his responsibilities without distraction." The apartment was quiet. From the living room came the sound of Grace declaring the rabbit the winner of the territorial dispute, and Junho's low voice conceding defeat with complete dignity. Joan looked at the envelope on her coffee table for a long moment. Then she looked up at Mrs. Kwan with an expression so calm and so level that the older woman's composed certainty flickered. Just barely, just once. "Mrs. Kwan," Joan said quietly, "I want you to pick that envelope up and put it back in your bag." The older woman blinked. "I think if you consider." "I want you to pick it up," Joan said again. Still quiet. Still completely steady. "Because if you leave it on my table I will have to return it to you, and I would prefer this conversation to end without either of us being embarrassed." Silence. "I am not a problem to be solved," Joan continued. "I am not a distraction to be managed. I am the woman who raised your grandchild alone for 7 years with no help from your family and no complaint to anyone. I built this life," she gestured around the apartment with a single quiet motion, "entirely on my own. And I did it beautifully." Mrs. Kwan was very still. "Your son came back into our lives because Grace and I allowed it. That was our choice. And the only person who has any say in whether he stays is me." Joan held the older woman's gaze without a single blink. "Not you. Not your envelope. Not your family legacy. Me." The silence that followed was the longest of the entire afternoon. Then something happened that Joan had not anticipated. Mrs. Kwan looked at her, truly looked at her, and the careful diplomatic mask slipped, just slightly, just enough. Underneath it was not anger. It was not offense. It was something that looked unmistakably like recognition. Woman to woman. Survivor to survivor. You love him, Mrs. Kwan said softly. Not an accusation. An observation. Joan said nothing. And he loves you. The older woman looked toward the living room where Junho's low voice and Grace's bright one were still tangled together in easy conversation. He has loved you for a very long time. I knew it before he did. Joan watched her carefully. I came here today. Mrs. Kwan paused. Looked down at the envelope she had not picked up. I came here because I am a mother who is afraid. That is all. Underneath everything else, I am simply a mother who is afraid of what loving you will cost my son. The admission landed quietly between them. Joan felt the anger in her chest shift. Not disappear but shift. Make room for something more complicated. Grace is the best thing that has ever happened to your son, Joan said finally. And I will spend my life protecting her. From anything. From anyone. Pause. Including you if I have to. But I would rather not. Mrs. Kwan looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached forward and picked the envelope up from the coffee table. She placed it back in her bag without a word. She picked up her teacup. She took a slow, deliberate sip. The tea is good, she said quietly. Thank you, Joan said. From the living room, Grace's voice rang out bright and clear. Junho, come and see what I drew. And then, after a beat, Halmoni, you come too. Both women turned toward the living room doorway. Mrs. Kwan looked at Joan with an expression that was cautious and complicated, and underneath it all, the very faintest beginning of something that was not quite a smile but was pointed in that direction. She called me Halmoni, the older woman said quietly. Grandmother. In Korean. She calls everyone something, Joan said. She decided on yours herself. Mrs. Kwan was quiet for a moment. Then she stood, smoothed her perfectly tailored trousers, and walked toward the living room and her granddaughter's voice with the careful steps of a woman navigating completely new territory. Joan sat alone with her tea for exactly 30 seconds. Then she heard it. Grace's voice explaining a drawing with enormous enthusiasm, Junho translating quietly in Korean for his mother, and underneath both of those sounds, soft, barely there, unmistakable, the sound of Mrs. Kwan asking Grace a question, in Korean, and Grace answering, making something up entirely, confident and unbothered as always, in English. And then the sound Joan had not expected and was completely unprepared for. Mrs. Kwan laughing, quiet, genuine. The laugh of a woman who had just met something she had no defense against. Joan set her teacup down, closed her eyes. And for the first time since this entire impossible story had reignited at her brother's wedding, she exhaled completely. Junho found out that evening. He had stayed after his mother left, helping Grace finish the drawing she had started, listening to the extended director's commentary Grace provided on every creative decision, staying for the simple dinner Joan had not planned to offer but somehow found herself making anyway. It had been easy in the way that things are when something is slowly, carefully becoming natural. Grace had fallen asleep at the dinner table, face pressed against her folded arms, cookie tucked under her chin, and Junho had carried her to her bedroom with a steadiness and tenderness that Joan watched from the doorway and said nothing about. When he came back to the kitchen, Joan was washing dishes. He stood at the counter beside her the way he had been learning to do, present without crowding, close without demanding. She handed him a dish to dry without being asked, and he took it without comment, and for a few minutes they existed in the quiet domesticity of it. Warm water and the sound of rain and the particular peace of a child sleeping safely in the next room. Then Joan said, without looking up from the sink, "Your mother brought an envelope today." The dish in Junho's hand went very still. "While you were in the living room with Grace," Joan continued, her voice measured and even. "She put it on my coffee table. It was thick, cream-colored, very expensive looking." Silence. "She asked me to take Grace and disappear," Joan said simply, quietly, generously. Her word, generously. The stillness coming from Junho beside her was a different kind of stillness from his usual kind. His usual stillness was controlled and deliberate, the stillness of a man who chose his reactions carefully. This was the stillness of a man holding something explosive completely motionless inside himself because the alternative was unacceptable. Joan turned off the tap, dried her hands, turned to look at him. His jaw was tight. His eyes were darker than she had ever seen them. The muscle in his cheek was working slowly. "Junho," she said quietly. "I'm sorry," he said. Whoa. Furious in the particular way that people are furious when someone they love has done something that cannot be undone. "I am so deeply sorry. She had no right." "I handled it," Joan said. He looked at her. "What did you say to her?" "I told her to pick the envelope up and put it back in her bag." Joan held his gaze steadily. "I told her I was not a problem to be solved. I told her the only person with any say in whether you stay in our lives is me." Something moved through Junho's expression, fierce and overwhelming and barely contained. "And then," Joan continued, her voice softening slightly, "she laughed at Grace's drawing and called her by her Korean name, and I think she might be slightly besotted with your daughter despite her best efforts not to be." Junho stared at her. "She's afraid," Joan said simply. "She's a mother who is afraid. I understand that even when I don't appreciate the method." The expression on Junho's face in that moment was something Joan knew she would carry for a very long time. He was looking at her the way you look at something you cannot believe exists, something you came so close to losing that the fact of its presence in front of you is almost too large to process. He reached out slowly, took her hand from where it rested on the counter, held it in both of his, careful, deliberate, the way he did everything that mattered to him. "You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known," he said quietly. "I have said that before. I will say it every day for the rest of my life if you let me." Joan looked down at their hands. His smooth, fair skin against her dark ebony. The contrast that had once felt like the symbol of everything complicated between them now feeling like the most natural thing in the world. "I'm still angry," she said softly. "At me. At all of it." He paused. "At 7 years. At the bathroom floor. At the mornings I got Grace dressed for school alone and pretended it was enough." She looked up at him. "At the fact that it was enough. And now you're here and it's different and I don't entirely know what to do with different." Junho looked at her steadily. "You don't have to know yet," he said. "I'm not going anywhere. I have nowhere I would rather be than exactly here." Joan searched his face for the performance, for the effort, for the crack in it. There was none. There was only him, standing in her kitchen on a rainy Saturday evening, her hand held in both of his, Grace asleep down the hall. His mother somewhere across the city being reluctantly unraveled by a 7-year-old with a stuffed bear named Cookie. "Your mother is going to be a problem," Joan said. "My mother," Junho said carefully, "met Grace today. She laughed at her drawing. It is already over. She just doesn't know it yet." Joan looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something she had not planned and could not entirely explain. She turned her hand over in his, so that instead of him holding her hand, they were holding each other's. Cool. Deliberate. A choice made quietly in a kitchen on a rainy evening. Junho looked down at their joined hands. When he looked back up, his eyes were the softest she had ever seen them. He lifted her hand slowly and pressed his lips to her knuckles. Gentle. Reverent. The kiss of a man who understood that this small, quiet, ordinary moment in a kitchen, was the most significant thing that had happened to him in 7 years. Joan felt it move through her from her hand to her chest and settle there permanently. "One chance," she reminded him softly. "One chance," he agreed against her hand. Outside the rain continued. Inside the apartment everything was warm and still and carefully, tenderly beginning. Down the hall Grace slept with Cookie pressed to her chest, a 7-year-old who had grabbed a stranger's hand at a wedding and pulled an entire broken family back together without ever knowing that was what she was doing. Some loves survive the silence. They wait in the dark, patient and stubborn and completely certain, until the people carrying them are finally strong enough and brave enough and ready enough to choose them in the light. Joan Daniels had survived the worst of it. The abandonment, the bathroom floor, The 7 years of magnificent aloneness. She had built something beautiful from the wreckage of what he left behind. And now she was choosing, with full knowledge, full memory and full power, to build something new. Not because she needed him, but because she wanted him. And that, after everything, was the most powerful thing of all. Was Joan right to stand her ground against Mrs. Kwan? Or should she have taken more time before letting Junho back into her heart? And what do you think Mrs. Kwan's next move will be, now that Grace has already found a way in? Drop your answers in the comments right now. I read every single one and I cannot wait to see what you think. If this story moved you the way I think it did, hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications because part 3 is already coming and it is going to be the most intense episode yet. Share this with someone who believes that love deserves a second chance, or someone who absolutely thinks Joan should have kept that door closed. Either way, this conversation needs to happen. Thank you for watching Afro-K Romance Fairy Tale. Until next time, keep believing in love that refuses to stay buried.